A man refused to pay 5 cents for a watermelon and triggered an international crisis. Drunk cadets turned Christmas eggnog into a military mutiny. And an entire city nearly got wiped out because they smashed the wrong statues. These are 32 real riots that prove humans will absolutely destroy everything over the dumbest reasons imaginable. 1. The Eggnog Riot of 1826 is what happens when you tell a bunch of future military leaders they cannot drink on Christmas. West Point Academy had a strict no-alcohol policy, but a crew of cadets, one of whom was a young Jefferson Davis, figured the holiday season deserved an exception. They smuggled in massive quantities of whiskey and turned the Christmas eggnog into what can only be described as a weaponized dairy cocktail. When officers showed up to end the festivities, the hammered cadets responded not by apologizing, but by pulling out their swords, attacking their commanding officers, destroying every window in sight, and reducing the barracks to rubble. The place looked like a battlefield, except the only enemy was sobriety. By sunrise, more than 70 cadets were facing charges for what started as a holiday party, cementing eggnog as possibly the most destabilizing beverage in military history. 2. In 1922, New York City had an unspoken fashion law that was apparently enforceable by mob violence, the Straw Hat Riot. The rule was simple. No man was allowed to wear a straw hat past September 15th, and breaking this code was treated like a personal insult to every person on the street. That year, roving gangs of teenagers took it upon themselves to be the fashion police, ripping straw hats off men's heads and crushing them underfoot. When hat owners started swinging back with fists and walking canes, the whole thing blew up into a multi-day street war that shut down traffic across the Manhattan Bridge. The police were completely overwhelmed, unable to tell the difference between aggressors and victims since everyone was just punching everyone. Dozens were arrested. Emergency rooms were flooded with busted faces and bruised egos. And all of it happened because some grown men refused to switch to a felt hat when autumn rolled around. 3. The Pocklington Bun Riot of 1819 is hard evidence that interrupting a British tradition involving free food is a death wish, even when that tradition takes place at a funeral. The town of Pocklington had a beloved custom where the local vicar handed out complimentary buns to the poor at every burial. Life was good. Then a new penny-pinching vicar showed up and decided the bun handouts were an unnecessary expense. The townspeople responded with the kind of diplomacy you would expect. They barricaded the church doors and locked the vicar inside mid-service. When the panicking clergyman finally made a run for it, the crowd showered him with rocks and rubble, screaming for their sacred pastries. The man literally had to be rescued by local authorities before the mourners finished what the funeral started. It was a full-blown religious standoff, motivated entirely by the right to eat free bread at someone's burial. 4. The Princeton Rebellion of 1807 was the moment America's brightest young minds proved that even geniuses will lose it if you feed them garbage long enough. Students at Princeton had been begging the administration for months to improve the cafeteria food, specifically the bread and soup, which they described as completely unfit for human consumption. When the university shrugged them off, the students did not politely escalate. They stormed Nassau Hall, the main campus building, barricaded every entrance, and effectively declared war on the administration. Some of them reportedly smashed furniture and hurled debris from the windows to keep faculty from entering. The university's response was equally dramatic. They expelled 125 students in one sweep, wiping out more than half the entire student body. To this day, it holds the record for the largest academic massacre ever triggered solely by an inedible lunch. 5. The Revolt of the Chompy. In 1378 was a wild moment in Florence when the people at the absolute bottom of society suddenly seized control of one of Europe's wealthiest cities. The Chompy were wool carders, the filthy, overworked laborers so low on the social ladder they were not even permitted to have their own guild. Fed up with being treated as subhuman, they stormed the government palace, took it over, and demanded a seat at the political table. For a few surreal weeks, ragged barefoot workers were actually governing Florence, forming guilds, and even knighting each other in a chaotic power grab. They passed laws, redistributed taxes, and for a brief shining moment genuinely believed the old world was dead. It was the medieval equivalent of the cleaning staff seizing control of a multinational corporation, and it lasted right up until the rich merchants paid mercenaries to violently remind everyone of their proper place. 6. History is full of food riots, but the Nottingham cheese riots of 1766 featured what might be the most absurd weaponry ever deployed in combat. During a cheese shortage, the mayor of Nottingham thought it was a great idea to sell the town's entire cheese supply to buyers from outside the region. The hungry locals disagreed violently. They blockaded the wagons, and when the mayor tried to push through by force, the crowd seized the cargo and immediately weaponized it. Enormous wheels of cheese, some weighing 100 pounds each, were sent rolling down the steep hills, bowling over the mayor and his men like they were pins at a lane. Witnesses described grown soldiers scrambling to dodge giant rounds of rolling dairy thundering down the cobblestones. It stands as the only recorded military engagement in history where the dominant weapon was cheese, and the authorities were literally defeated by high-speed cheddar. 7. The Soup Kettle Revolt of 1826 was the moment the janissaries, the legendary elite warriors of the Ottoman Empire, made their last and worst tactical decision. These soldiers had a centuries-old tradition. Whenever they were fed up with the Sultan, they flipped over their giant soup kettles in the dining hall. The message was clear: we refuse to eat from your table. So when Sultan Mahmud II announced plans to modernize the military, the janissaries did their signature move one final time, tipped the kettles, and marched toward the palace expecting negotiations. The Sultan had other plans. He had already positioned modern artillery around their barracks, and he opened fire without hesitation. The bombardment was so intense that the barracks were reduced to smoking rubble in less than an hour. The janissaries essentially showed up to a gunfight armed with ladles, and the entire legendary corps was erased from existence in a single bloody afternoon. 8. The St. Scholastica Day riot of 1355 is still the deadliest clash between a university and the locals in recorded history, and the whole catastrophe began with a glass of bad wine. Two students at Oxford University were sitting in a tavern when they told the owner his wine tasted like straight vinegar. The owner talked back, and one of the students responded by smashing a heavy wooden mug into his skull. That one drunken outburst detonated a full 3-day urban war between the townspeople and the student body. Citizens showed up with longbows and arrows, students grabbed swords, and the streets of Oxford turned into a genuine medieval battlefield with no clear front line. When the carnage finally ended, close to 100 people lay dead in the streets. Oxford University ultimately won the legal aftermath and forced the town's mayor to march through the city hatless once a year for the next 500 years as penance. 9. The Rebecca riots of 1839 in Wales featured what has to be the most bewildering rebel uniform in the history of armed resistance. Furious about being bled dry by tollgate fees on public roads, Welsh farmers decided to fight back, but their choice of disguise was unexpected. Grown, muscular men squeezed into women's dresses, strapped on bonnets, and smeared their faces with soot. They named their leader Rebecca and called themselves her daughters, borrowing from a Bible passage about seizing the gates of your enemies. Night after night, this militia of cross-dressing farmers descended on the toll booths, obliterated the gates, and vanished before dawn. Some of them even stayed in character, speaking in high-pitched voices and referring to each other as sisters while swinging sledgehammers. The authorities were left completely baffled, chasing an army of furious men in skirts and petticoats through the Welsh countryside with nothing to show for it. 10. When London's Covent Garden Theatre jacked up its ticket prices in 1809, the audience did not simply stop attending. They launched the Old Price Riots, a 67-night siege of pure creative torment. Every single evening for over 2 months, protesters purchased tickets, took their seats, and then made it physically impossible to perform anything on stage. They smuggled in live pigs that squealed through entire acts, hammered on pots and pans, blasted trumpets, and chanted OP for old prices in deafening unison. The desperate actors tried performing in total silence using gestures, but it was pointless against the wall of barnyard chaos erupting from the seats. Some rioters even brought signs and banners mocking the theater owner by name, turning the auditorium into a nightly public humiliation. After weeks of financial hemorrhaging and psychological warfare, the theater's management finally caved, issued a public apology, and dropped the prices back down, proving that relentless annoyance is an extremely effective form of protest. 11. The Watermelon War is the definitive argument for why you should always pay for your food, especially when you're hammered. In 1856, a drunk American named Jack Oliver was killing time at a train station in Panama when he snatched a slice of watermelon from a street vendor and flatly refused to hand over the 5-cent payment. The vendor insisted on his money, Jack pulled a gun, and what should have been a petty shoplifting incident instantly erupted into a full-scale battle between hundreds of locals and Americans shooting at each other in the streets. Buildings were set ablaze, storefronts were looted, and the entire neighborhood around the station descended into total war. By the time the smoke cleared, 16 people were dead, the train station had been burned to ashes, and an international diplomatic crisis was in full swing, all because one intoxicated man could not be bothered to pay a nickel for a piece of fruit. 12. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD ranks among the bloodiest uprisings in Chinese history, and its foundation was built on a spectacularly bad assumption. The revolt was led by a Taoist mystic named Zhang Jue, who persuaded hundreds of thousands of peasant followers that his magical spells and sacred chants would render their bodies completely immune to blades and arrows. Overflowing with this dangerously misplaced confidence, the rebels wrapped yellow cloth around their heads and charged straight into the waiting imperial forces. Shockingly, the laws of physics did not bend to accommodate their beliefs, and the imperial blades cut through them exactly as you would expect sharp metal to do. The battlefield quickly became a graveyard of men who genuinely believed they were invincible right up until the moment they were not. The ensuing slaughter cost millions of lives, offering a brutal lesson that spiritual conviction is powerful, but it is absolutely no substitute for actual armor. 13. In 1907, the winemakers of southern France erupted in revolt because cheap counterfeit wine was flooding the market and destroying their income. The panicked government in Paris dispatched the 17th Infantry Regiment to put the uprising down with military force. There was just one enormous problem. The soldiers in that regiment had been recruited directly from those same wine-producing villages. When the troops marched in and found themselves face-to-face with their own families and childhood neighbors, the military operation collapsed instantly. The soldiers flipped their rifles skyward in open defiance of their officers, broke formation, and sprinted into the crowd to embrace the protesters. Their commanding officers stood there helpless, watching their entire unit dissolve into a family reunion. The whole confrontation ended with soldiers and rioters sharing bottles of wine and belting out patriotic hymns together, which is genuinely the most perfectly French conclusion to any conflict ever. 14. The Battle of George Square. In 1919, transformed downtown Glasgow into an actual combat zone, and the whole thing started because workers wanted their week to be a few hours shorter. A massive strike demanding a 40-hour work week brought more than 60,000 people into the city center. The British government in London panicked, convinced that Scotland was about to have its own Bolshevik revolution, and responded with wildly disproportionate force. Police launched a baton charge directly into the crowd, which ignited a full-blown riot, and then Winston Churchill personally authorized tanks and machine guns to be deployed through Glasgow's streets. Soldiers set up barbed wire barricades around key buildings as if they were defending against a foreign invasion rather than their own citizens. For several surreal days, the city resembled a World War I battlefield, with armed soldiers standing guard over the post office against crowds of union workers whose only crime was wanting to leave work a bit earlier on Fridays. 15. The macaroni riots in 17th century Naples had a name that sounds like an Italian cooking disaster, but they were born from genuine starvation and a deeply stupid tax on fruit. The government had already been shrinking bread loaves, and when they piled a new tax on fresh fruit on top of that, the population reached its breaking point. The people rallied behind a charismatic fisherman named Masaniello, who led a furious uprising and essentially crowned himself ruler of Naples in a matter of hours. but absolute power rotted his brain at record speed. Within days, Masaniello was ordering executions on a whim, parading through the streets in royal robes, and behaving like a raving lunatic who had completely forgotten he used to sell fish for a living. His entire reign lasted just 9 days before his own followers stabbed him to death, proving that everyone despises unfair taxes, but they despise a deranged fisherman dictator even more. 16. The Riot of the Statues in Antioch. In 387 is a textbook case of doing something incredibly satisfying and then immediately regretting every second of it. Enraged by crushing new taxes from Emperor Theodosius, the citizens lost all self-control and went on a rampage, smashing the imperial bronze statues of the emperor and his family and dragging the fragments through the streets like trophies. It was thrilling in the moment. Then morning came. The entire city collectively realized they had just committed high treason against a man with one of the largest armies on the planet. Overnight, Antioch went from fury to pure, paralyzing dread. For weeks, the streets were deserted as thousands crammed into churches, sobbing and begging for divine mercy, while rumors spread daily that the imperial army was already marching south to level the city. The emperor eventually chose forgiveness, but it is safe to say no one in that city ever looked at a statue the wrong way again. 17. The dog tax war of 1898 sounds like something a comedy writer would pitch and get laughed out of the room, but it was a genuine armed confrontation in New Zealand. The British colonial government decided the most logical way to generate revenue from the Maori tribes in the north was to impose a tax on every dog they owned. For the Maori, dogs were not household decorations. They were critical hunting companions and survival tools, and taxing them was a profound insult. When the tribes refused to pay up, the government did not send a polite reminder. They sent a fully armed military column with artillery to collect the fee. The standoff dragged on for weeks, with both sides dug in and ready to kill over an argument about pet licensing. The Maori leader, Hon Toya, prepared for guerrilla warfare, and both sides came terrifyingly close to wiping each other out over a few coins per dog. 18. Long before they were running the country, Harvard's finest students were waging war against the dining hall in the Great Butter Rebellion of 1766. The butter being served was so unspeakably rotten that it reportedly reeked like a dead animal, which inspired the students to launch their protest under the unforgettable rallying cry, "Behold, our butter stinketh." But this was no minor cafeteria squabble. The students boycotted their classes, took over campus buildings, and created such administrative havoc that the governor of Massachusetts himself had to abandon his actual government duties and ride to the campus to personally broker a peace deal over spoiled dairy. A colonial governor negotiating the terms of a butter ceasefire with a bunch of angry teenagers is one of the most underrated images in American history. It remains a timeless reminder that you can fill a university with the most brilliant minds in the nation, but serve them rancid butter long enough and they will set the whole place on fire. 19. The opera riots of 1830 in Brussels hold the unique distinction of being the only theater performance in history that accidentally created an entire country. The audience was watching The Mute Girl of Portici, an opera centered on a rebellion against foreign oppressors. When the performers hit a duet about sacred love for the homeland, the crowd did not simply clap. They leaped from their seats, poured out of the theater, and launched an actual armed revolution right there in the streets. Within hours, barricades were going up across Brussels, and the Dutch garrison was under siege by people who had been peacefully sitting in velvet seats just moments earlier. They torched government buildings, clashed with Dutch soldiers, and within a few months, Belgium officially existed as an independent nation. Normal people grabbed dinner after a show. These audience members grabbed weapons and founded a sovereign country, which is the most extreme review of a live performance ever recorded. 20. The Battle of the Gown. In 1381 gave the townspeople of Cambridge the chance they had been dreaming about for decades: total revenge on the arrogant university that lorded over them. When the chaos of the peasants' revolt swept through England, the locals who had spent years resenting the privileged academics finally saw their opening. They did not just rough up a few students. They invaded the university's archive vaults, dragged out every charter and legal document that granted the institution its power and privileges, and hauled the whole collection to the town square. They set the priceless manuscripts ablaze while an elderly woman screamed, "Away with the learning of clerks! Away with it!" The bonfire of centuries of scholarship lit up the sky as the crowd cheered like it was a holiday celebration. Then, as a finishing touch, they cornered the trembling professors and forced them to sign a document declaring themselves worthless, which might be the most brutal academic evaluation in history. 21. The cholera riots that tore across Europe throughout the 1830s were driven by one of the most tragically destructive conspiracy theories ever conceived. As cholera decimated entire communities, the impoverished and uneducated masses had no understanding of bacteria or how disease actually spread. So they invented their own explanation. The doctors and the government were deliberately poisoning the water supply to exterminate the poor and save money. This horrifying belief led to an unthinkable outcome where angry mobs tracked down and killed the very medical professionals desperately trying to keep them alive. Hospitals were ransacked, doctors were beaten to death in broad daylight, and sick patients were dragged from their beds in a so-called rescue, only to die untreated at home. In some cities, medical workers had to disguise themselves and travel in secret just to avoid being lynched by the people they were trying to help. All of it unfolded because entire populations became convinced that the cure was the actual disease. 22. When the British government switched to the Gregorian calendar in 1752 to sync up with mainland Europe, it triggered one of the most absurd public meltdowns in English history, the calendar riots. The adjustment required skipping 11 days in September, so citizens went to sleep on the 2nd and officially woke up on the 14th. Rather than appreciating this harmless administrative correction, thousands took to the streets howling, "Give us our 11 days back," in the sincere belief that the government had physically stolen 11 days from their lives. Some people were reportedly terrified that they had been aged by 11 days overnight and were now closer to death than they had been at bedtime. But it was not all superstitious nonsense. There was a real financial grievance, as landlords still demanded full rent for a month that was suddenly 11 days shorter. The collision of genuine money anxiety and total scientific confusion turned a simple date change into a national meltdown. 23. You can take a lot from a German citizen without consequence, but history has made it abundantly clear that the moment you touch the beer, you have declared war. In 1844, King Ludwig I of Bavaria committed the unforgivable sin of raising the beer tax, nudging the price of a stein slightly upward. Munich responded as if he had insulted every citizen's mother. Mobs smashed their way into breweries and ripped the city apart in what became the legendary beer riots. The king deployed his army to restore order, but he had forgotten one crucial fact. His soldiers were also Bavarians who liked cheap beer just as much as everyone else. The troops flatly refused to shoot their fellow drinkers and reportedly even handed them ammunition, turning the king's own military into a supply line for the opposition. Left with zero options and zero loyal soldiers, the humiliated king had no choice but to reverse the price hike before his entire kingdom collapsed. 24. The broken chair. Riot of 1947 in Paris is a masterclass in how one trivial moment of bad luck can snowball into total urban destruction. It began in a packed movie theater when a man's seat collapsed underneath him during the screening. Rather than calmly requesting a replacement or his money back, the man launched into a furious shouting match with the theater owner, which quickly devolved into punches. The rest of the audience, apparently more entertained by the real fight than whatever was on screen, piled into the brawl. The chaos burst through the doors and onto the street, where random pedestrians decided to join in for no discernible reason. Windows shattered, shop fronts were wrecked, and the violence spread down the block like a wildfire that feeds on stupidity. The police had to be called in to restore order to an entire city block left in ruins, all because one rusty bolt in a cinema seat gave out at exactly the wrong time. 25. The Nika riots of 532 AD are the original sports riot. And they make every modern stadium brawl look like a polite disagreement. Constantinople was fanatically devoted to chariot racing, with the entire population split between two rival factions called the Blues and the Greens. These groups normally spent their energy attacking each other, but when Emperor Justinian attempted to arrest some of their most violent hooligans, the rivals made a historic alliance against the throne. What began as an angry sports demonstration spiraled into a citywide apocalypse. The united mob set fire to half of Constantinople, destroying the original Hagia Sophia, all while chanting Nika, meaning conquer. For 5 straight days, the greatest city in the world burned, while the emperor hid in his palace debating whether to flee by sea. Justinian nearly abandoned the empire, but instead he lured the rioters into the hippodrome and unleashed his army, ending the day with an estimated 30,000 dead spectators. 26. The Balloon Riot of 1864 in Leicester is a stunning demonstration of how fast an excited crowd can transform into a rampaging horde when they feel cheated out of a show. Thousands of spectators had assembled to watch a celebrated aeronaut named Henry Coxwell launch his latest hot air balloon, which was considered the most thrilling technology of the era. But when a faulty gas valve prevented the balloon from inflating properly, the crowd was not interested in hearing about mechanical failures. Convinced they had been swindled, the mob charged the launch site, tore the expensive balloon into shreds, demolished the basket, and destroyed every piece of scientific gear in sight. The poor aeronaut barely escaped with his life as the crowd turned from disappointed spectators into a full demolition crew. Then, still fuming, and apparently needing more things to wreck, they turned on a nearby library that had absolutely nothing to do with any of it and tried to burn that down too. 27. The Dorr Rebellion of 1841 in Rhode Island had all the ingredients of a legendary uprising, but the execution of a wet firecracker. Through a bizarre political situation, the state somehow ended up with 2 men claiming to be the legitimate governor at the same time, the official one and a self-declared people's champion named Thomas Dorr. Deciding that only one governor could survive, Dorr assembled a ragtag militia and marched on the state arsenal to seize its weapons in a dramatic show of force. Everything was building to a pivotal moment in American history until Dorr gave the order to fire the cannons and the old, moisture-soaked gunpowder simply refused to work. The cannons produced a pathetic, wheezing sputter in the fog. Several of his own men reportedly took one look at the failed artillery and immediately deserted on the spot. With his entire revolution literally defeated by the weather, Dorr and his embarrassed followers quietly loaded up their useless guns and shuffled home to bed. 28. The Decembrist revolt of 1825 in Russia was a noble attempt to bring constitutional democracy to the empire. But the plan had one beautifully absurd weakness hidden inside its own battle cry. The rebel officers commanded their soldiers to march into Senate Square shouting, "For Constantine and the Constitution," a reference to the Tsar's brother and the concept of democratic government. The problem was that the average Russian soldier at the time was an illiterate peasant with absolutely zero understanding of political theory. They marched, and they chanted exactly as ordered. But it later emerged that a huge number of the troops genuinely believed Constitution was the name of Constantine's wife. So there they stood in the freezing cold, ready to die on the barricades for what they assumed was a love story. These men were staring down execution not for the cause of democracy, but because they thought they were defending a lovely lady called Madame Constitution in some kind of royal family argument. 29. The Salt Riot of 1648 in Moscow is proof that you can squeeze a Russian citizen on just about anything, but the second you threaten his ability to preserve food for winter, you have signed your own death warrant. Salt was the essential ingredient for keeping meat and vegetables from rotting through the brutal cold months. So when Tsar Alexei's advisors decided to replace a bundle of existing taxes with one enormous tax on salt, the price exploded and food started spoiling across the city. The population did not organize a peaceful demonstration. A colossal mob crashed through the gates of the Kremlin, demanding that the men behind the tax be handed over. The Tsar, fearing for his own neck, gave the advisors up. The crowd ripped them apart and dumped what was left into piles of manure, sending a message so graphic and so permanent that no Russian official dared touch the price of salt again for a very long time. 30. The Escalache riots of 1766 in Spain prove that you can drain a man's wallet, but the moment you tell him what hat to wear, you have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The Marquis of Escalache, a minister under King Charles III, attempted to modernize Madrid by outlawing the traditional long capes and wide-brimmed hats, arguing that criminals use them as disguises. In their place, he mandated short, French-style capes and tricorn hats. The Spanish public treated this not as a safety measure, but as a declaration of cultural war. 50,000 people flooded the streets, ripping down streetlights and ransacking the minister's home. Some rioters were spotted wearing their banned capes and hats defiantly, essentially daring the authorities to come and take them. The king had to physically flee to another palace and fire Esquilache to restore peace, confirming that Spaniards would genuinely prefer to topple a government rather than be caught dressing like the French. 31. The Green Corn Rebellion of 1917 was perhaps the most ambitiously doomed uprising in American history. A band of dirt-poor tenant farmers in rural Oklahoma hatched a plan to personally end World War I by marching all the way to Washington, D.C. and forcing President Wilson to cancel the draft. Their logistical strategy for this cross-country military campaign was to survive exclusively on roasted green corn and barbecued beef foraged along the route. They genuinely believed that other oppressed farmers would join their march along the way, swelling their numbers into an unstoppable army by the time they reached the capital. Predictably, their revolution barely lasted a few days before a local sheriff and his posse tracked them down without much effort. The rebels were exhausted, vastly outnumbered, and reportedly crippled by severe stomach problems from eating nothing but unripe corn, proving that a revolution fueled entirely by indigestible food is not going to make it very far. 32. In 1825, Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia was designed to be a refined sanctuary for young American gentlemen, but the students turned it into an absolute nightmare during the Great Rotunda riot. Wealthy, privileged students protesting the university's strict disciplinary code decided that property destruction and biological warfare were reasonable responses. They hurled bottles of urine at faculty members, shattered windows across campus, and detonated gunpowder to blast a professor's front door clean off its hinges. One faculty member reportedly barricaded himself inside his home with a loaded musket, unsure if he was dealing with students or an actual invading army. The chaos grew so extreme that the Board of Visitors, a group that included 3 former presidents of the United States, had to convene an emergency session to confront the rioters face to face. Thomas Jefferson, 82 years old at the time, was so devastated by the sheer idiocy on display that he broke down crying in front of them. Making a founding father weep is a truly remarkable achievement in failure. All right, be brutally honest right now. What is the pettiest, most embarrassing thing that would make you personally start a riot? Not some noble cause? The real, shameful answer. Put it in the comments. If this proved humanity has always been insane, hit like and subscribe before the government steals your 11 days too.